Well, thank you again for that last presentation. And now it is my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Deborah Bowen. Dr. Bowen is a professor in the Department of Bioethics.
If I may, I'm sorry to interrupt. Oh, great. Dr. Bowen is resolving her issues. Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt.
That's quite all right. I'm glad we have the technical support. Thank you. So Dr. Bowen is a professor in the Department of Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Washington. She was recently a professor and chair in the Department of Community Health Sciences of the School of Public Health at Boston University. She's been the principal investigator of several NIH-funded grants involving cancer risk feedback and communication. And Dr. Bowen has also been an investigator in the coordinating centers of 3 large multi-center prevention trials. She is currently conducting community-based research to improve the health of Native people in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska in collaboration with community partners. And she's currently evaluating the implementation of innovations in healthcare and public health settings. At Boston University, she was the director of Prevention Research Center, which focused on improving the health of public housing residents. She's conducted many types of research into the health and health disparities of sexual minority individuals for many years. And in addition, Dr. Bowen has led or participated in numerous community intervention studies that have successfully recruited and maintained advisory committees, including members of the community representing the target audience. She's also co-investigator and member of the steering committee for a large R25T training grant for pre- and postdoctoral fellows at the University of Washington, focusing on health communications and behavioral cancer prevention. I hope you'll all join me in a warm welcome of Dr. Bowen, personal hero of mine, as we hear about her current work.
Well, thank you for that very nice introduction. So I'm going to talk to you about a piece of work that we're doing currently that for us, for the group that I work with, pulls together a little bit of methodology with the science that we really want to do. And I guess I see this as a way to apply relatively mainstream tools like a systematic review to the study of sexual minority people and a study of change over time in those sexual minority people. So I guess I'm encouraging us to use these tools, the tools of the field, as the previous investigators did, to try to understand what's going on with sexual minority persons or their families. So I think that is an understudied and underused strategy here. So I'm going to encourage us to spend more time with that strategy. I'm going to talk specifically about a systematic review that we are in the middle of completing that looks at the intervention publications for sexual minority women in intervention specifically for health behavior change. So I'll talk about where we are, that's the systematic review, and I'll talk about what we think the next steps should be. So the good news is there's a full employment act for folks who are interested in this field because we have a lot to do. Here are my colleagues in our working group. These are people who I've worked with before in various capacities. You know, besides the time zone problems, they're a great group to work with. We've all been active in designing interventions and designing more epidemiologic kinds of studies that feed the interventions. So we've all worked on conducting this systematic review, and I'm hoping you'll see this within the next few months, submitted to a journal and out in press. So that's our goal. So background, this audience certainly doesn't need a lot of background on this issue. This is an exciting time, I think, for research into LGBTQ people or sexual minority people or gender and sexual minority people, however one wants to phrase this. This is a time of discovery. This is almost an opportunity in one's career that one, if you're around long enough, you get to see once in a while. And I think this is a great time for doing this kind of research. Certainly it has its problems, and certainly we can fuss over them. But indeed, if you look at the data would suggest a constant climb over the past 15 years in publications and grants fundings in these areas. And this is, again, I think this is an exciting time. Let me show you data from a paper that we published in 2012 in American Journal of Public Health that actually documents why this is an exciting time. If you look at the changes over time that have occurred in simple raw counts of grants and publications, this article documents those in public health. I think you'll agree that this the field is growing, and almost growing so fast that we struggle to keep our minds around it. So that's exciting. That's when science gets very exciting, because we learn from the give and take of each other. And this is a time when we're not playing solo anymore. We're out there with a lot of different people making a lot of different statements and trying to understand what's going on. So this is good news. I think the bad news is that we worried that we had a dearth of intervention studies. And we've conducted some of them. Other people that I've noticed in the panel have also conducted some of these intervention studies. But proportional to the numbers of studies that documented the disparity itself, in other words, great and strong epidemiology that leads us in a direction that we need to do something about, when we actually come to doing something about in an evidence-based fashion, we worried that we were not up yet to the challenge. So we wanted to conduct this systematic review of intervention studies that target sexual minority women to figure that out, and to figure out where the patterns were in the field, and to figure out future directions in our own research from where we identify the patterns. So that's our purpose today, is to tell you about this systematic review and to leave, I'm hoping, some hopeful and some negative kinds of conclusions from that systematic review that certainly lead us in the next generation of studies. So we used PRISMA as a guidelines document for systematic reviews. And so for those of you who have never done a systematic review, it's probably a good idea to go Google PRISMA and find the article and read it, because it documents the procedures that you need to use to do a rigorous systematic review. There are other guidelines documents, but I like PRISMA because it's well spelled out and well used and well accepted by grant reviewers and paper reviewers, and we understand what it means, and I think it's a reasonable framework to work within. We use the common steps of systematic reviews. This one was particularly interesting because we had trouble with step one, searching for electronic versions of articles that might be included, because the field is not consistent in its terminology. So it would be different if this field used the same terminology every time there was an intervention study for, let's say, quote unquote lesbians that recruited lesbians or other kinds of sexual minority women. But the terminology is, as you might imagine, dancing all over the place. So searching electronically was complicated in the beginning. Nevertheless, we found a large grouping of, and we had to use many databases because we worried that some of our materials would be published in databases that were not PubMed. And so we had to go to 3 different databases to be able to give us confidence that we had found everything we could find. Step 2 was an initial coding, reading the abstract and titles. And I'll show you the eligibility criteria in just one sec. Step 3 focused on each of the team members coding. We did double coding, so we have double coding on all these articles to make sure that we've got the right variables in our data set. But step 3 involved reading the entire article and coding it. And then we created tables that laid out the eligible articles and laid out their properties so that we could begin to understand them. And these are common steps in a systematic review for those of you who have never done one before. They help us, certainly they exclude things that we wish we were able to include, but they ensure that we are only able to include those articles with reasonable methodology such that we're not making conclusions on something that is a little shaky. So that's the purpose of using a systematic review methodology. A little bit more exclusive, but in the end gives us what I think is the strongest data for moving forward with conclusions. Here are the eligibility criteria for including articles in our review. We had to really search to find, and in some cases, surprisingly, it was not clear that the articles had sexual minority women as recruited participants. You'd think that might be something that we would write about in these articles, but not every time. So we had to contact several authors and say, did you include anything called women in that article or not, perhaps? The article had to describe an intervention to reduce disparities. The intervention, we limited this systematic review to individual interventions, partly because that's where most of the literature was, and partly because we wanted to make sure to be comparing similar kinds of projects. So, for example, we didn't include interventions that tried to change structures around healthcare delivery such that delivery would be more supportive or conducive to participation by sexual minority women. We did not include those. There were very few of them, I should say. Intervention studies tend to be difficult to do at a multi-level, in a multi-level manner. And so we have to date, I think we produced 0 multi-level interventions that were published. We had to reject a couple of more structural interventions, but we gathered most of the intervention work in this systematic review. We had to be able to evaluate through the article the intervention results that included something that looked to us like a health behavior outcome or a health-related outcome. Could have been a mental health status outcome, could have been other kinds of quality, even we let in quality of care kinds of outcomes. Again, most of them targeted health behaviors through individual intervention, but that's not true of every article. And finally, we wanted it published in the past 10 years, although we didn't actually lose very many by not looking at the older literature. So these are our eligibility criteria, and they, in my experience in systematic reviews for this field, they took a little bit longer to sort out because the definitions were very much all over the map, very much diverse, as our field is really diverse and eclectic. So were the publications. So we had to sort through the articles and have many discussions about what was eligible and what was not before we settled on our articles. Here is the initial set of results for simply number of articles. Our first set of searches yielded 684 articles. This is very common, right, in a systematic review where people use all kinds of search terms to get to articles, but they don't necessarily report the entire package in that article. They simply talk about a potential intervention, for example. So there were a lot of articles that called for intervention, relatively few articles, 34 articles, when we just looked at the title and abstract. And then finally, we kept 12 articles that, to us, met all the eligibility criteria. So we went from 684 to 12, and we lost some interesting things along the way, which we'll talk about in our publication. But we feel very secure that the things that we did look at were strong, and when they concluded something, we could get behind that conclusion. As we said, only 12 articles met our criteria. common reasons for ineligibility, which you might want to think about, because these are the articles that never made it into the count. People often indicated that they did an intervention, but they did not describe it. We had no other information other than participants received an intervention. So if that's the way they did it, we did not include them because we couldn't actually, we couldn't actually evaluate the intervention. Or there was no, this is actually more common, there was no evaluation of the intervention either published in that article or even available when we contacted the authors. So one common conclusion that I see in our field is that we do a lot of interventions. We simply don't publish the results because either we don't evaluate them or we don't want to pull that together into publication. And I think that's a loss, because when I read other fields, I read all kinds of articles and intervention articles. Not all of them are randomized trials, but I am able to get information from them about what might work that I might want to move forward into a randomized trial. And so without that publication history, we are left struggling to try to understand even pilot data on what might work. So with no evaluation in many of our articles, we had to reject them because we had no way of saying, yeah, this is a good thing, or no, this is not, let's not try this again because this did not work. We originally got on our high horse and decided to drop all articles that did not analyze by subgroups. In other words, did not analyze sexual minority women separately from sexual minority men or other kinds of participants in the study. We rapidly realized that our review was shrinking. And so we included articles that clearly recruited sexual minority women. And even if they did not break out the analysis by subgroup, in other words, we don't really know whether the intervention worked equally or better or worse in women versus men. We don't know that for many of these articles. However, we do understand that the intervention overall worked, and we figured that this was a starting place and a first systematic review. In 10 years, I hope to be able to say something very different about this field, but right now, we're stuck with this idea that we have to do this almost with our eyes closed, because we can't really indicate that women are faring equally or similarly to men or to other kinds of people in these studies. We can't really say that from this systematic review. And that's too bad, because we wanted to in the beginning. Here are some commonalities among the articles that did make it into the review. The designs were relatively weak. When I think of intervention studies, you know, we all use the gold standard of randomized controlled trials. And only 3 were randomized controlled trials of the 12 that made it into the study. Sometimes the analyses and the data collection were cross-sectional in nature. Sometimes they were a simple pre-post design. And those are all great things, but and possibly because randomized controlled trials are more difficult to do, or they take more work to do. But I think that we ought to take a look at our designs and find ways of building in stronger, even if it's only partially stronger designs on the intervention studies that we are doing. You can see the behavioral focus is a bit broad. There were many, many studies of the 12, 7 had to do with smoking behavior among adult sexual minority women and persons. A couple had to do with obesity or metabolic kinds of changes and other health behaviors, including a focus on mental health outcomes in some of the other articles. So we've got a bit of spread on the topics, although certainly smoking was a place where the field felt comfortable, because it was actually one of the most powerful disparities identified early on. We probably felt comfortable conducting intervention studies that provided information on sexual minority persons and change in smoking behavior. The recruitment occurred in multiple settings. These were not all bar studies. They were not all medical studies. They were conducted and recruited from many different places, often many different places in the same study. So there were not really any patterns that we could determine about recruitment sources or settings that would give us a kind of a focus. The follow-up was incredibly variable. We got follow-ups of days or weeks, months. I think only one article had anything over a few months. But a couple of articles, actually, 2 articles did have longer follow-up periods, which is good for health behavior change articles because sustainability is always a problem in health behavior change. And finally, the diversity focus within the studied articles and the chosen articles was, I would use the word terrible, except I'm probably not supposed to use that word about research. But I think it was terrible. They are very much focused on people called white lesbians. And there's very little ethnic diversity in this sample. There's almost no socioeconomic status diversity that we know of that is documented in the study. There are no sexuality diversity kinds of variables. For example, we found no studies that met our criteria in transgender samples at all. So we don't know anything about any sort of diversity in a very broad sense in this group of articles. So this is, I think, again, a big gap that we need to pay attention to and we need to understand. Finally, most of the interventions reviewed in the article, in the 12 selected articles, were successful. They did manage to change behavior, whether that outcome of change was change relative to heterosexual persons or simply change in the sample recruited. I believe all but one intervention was successful in making and documenting that change. So the good news is when we actually sit down and do this, we're pretty good at it. And we are able to produce health behavior change. And that's not always true in the field of health promotion. So I think that's good news for us because it means to me that we've got willing and ready populations that might need some help in performing appropriate health behaviors or healthful health behaviors, and we know how to do it, we just don't do it very frequently. This is our initial analysis of why we've got such a low.
I just need to let you know that we're short on time.
Okay, I've got 2 more slides, I think, so I'm pretty done. Here are some of the reasons that we came up with for why we think we have a dearth of intervention studies. You can read them. None of them are for certain. These are all speculation on our part. Certainly, they're harder to do. The funding has not been there, and it takes time to develop an intervention history with pilot data, but there are some exceptions, and folks have been doing these interventions. So I think that this is a thing that's very possible. We just need to set our minds and do it. I think that there is in many queer communities a devaluation of expert knowledge, and so that is something that we can talk about in the Q&A if we wish. But we all get the sense that there's sometimes a gap between community and academic, and where you've got the expertise to design these kinds of rigorous trials is in academia. So this is a problem that we need to overcome. Our conclusions are simple. We feel like we're behind the 8 ball here, and we need to pay more attention to intervention research. Actual methodology for studying queer populations or sexual minority populations is still in, I think, nascent stages, but we're working it out. I think that we need to push for more resources, but I actually also think that we need to push for more investigators using those resources, applying for the RFAs through intervention work so that we get reviewers used to reading intervention studies for sexual minority persons, and we're able to get more of them funded, on the books and funded. And here are some of our future directions. They, again, are all speculation. We think we're going to pursue some of these, and these might make great discussion topics for our Q&A later on. Thank you.